Thanks, good to be back again. Wow. So I'm going to do a whiteboard experiment today. So who's on Facebook? Yeah, it's great, isn't it? This is the photo that I put up there to annoy my mother. But the winters are very long in Utah, bitterly cold, and experiments with facial hair are some of the things that we do. So, but you know, it's been fun for me because I've been away from Australia for nearly 20 years now, and I've got these school friends that I like to connect with every now and then. And every now and then, someone will pop up that you haven't seen for a long time. And sometimes it's like, wow, I totally recognize you, I know who you are. And other times like, whoa, you have not aged well. Right? Have you ever contacted people like that? And you start to wonder, you know, what is, as Nu Skin, as an anti-aging company, that's always sort of a fun experiment to do. How are your friends aging? And, you know, as I said before, my father, you know, who had the cholesterol issue, also, I guess he's got a lot of issues, my dad, he said, you know, there's this guy that I know who's just looks so much younger than me, and I don't know how he does it. What is it? Is it a good living? I think I live a pretty good life. And it makes you wonder, doesn't it? Is it genetics? You know, like someone earlier today was blaming their mother for how they aged, right? But then realized maybe there's something that we can do about it. Now, I talked earlier, I gave a bit of an introduction to the company. Today I want to talk a little bit more about where we're moving into, the new frontier, which is an understanding of genetics and the role that it plays in how we age. But, so I mentioned also that we are an anti-aging company. We finally learned who we are after all these years. And ageLOC, what is it? Now, before I go into a whole bunch of detail, you expect if the PhD comes on stage that it's all about science, and some of you may be doing a continuing education course in genetics or medicine. This is a great opportunity to bone up on the genetics and the science and the mathematics. And you know, to be perfectly honest, when I first joined this company, I thought that was sort of my job, to teach science to you guys. And then I realized, you know, that really isn't my job, okay? And I want you guys to be excited about science, but I realized that there probably aren't that many geeks here. The important thing, though, is that you get a feel. I mean, I think, if I know you guys, what you want to do is to have integrity in your business. You want to be engaged with a company that has integrity, and the products have scientific integrity. And some of you, I think, feel like it's your job to really write down notes like crazy right now, so that when you meet your next contact, you'll be a little bit more scientific, and you'll be able to explain the science and the genetics and how the metabolic pathways are changing and the phytochemicals in nature. I can name 17 of them. You know, let's reassess our goals. I want you, after the end of this talk, to feel confident in the science. I want you to feel like there's something to it, but you don't have to know the science. Another goal for the meeting is, so I want you to walk away feeling confident that the science is there, that Nu Skin is a science-based company. Another goal is maybe some snippets, some phrases that you can use that will encapsulate that science. So I'll try to capture some of those today and help you to, well, let's have fun learning about what we're doing here. So here's the goals. The science is real, and some tips, some things that you might say to share that with your friends without getting like so bogged down in the science that you have to sort of sneak out because your contact has fallen asleep in the middle of your presentation. Right? All right, so aging, it's a really interesting thing. And here's the big difference between what we're doing at Nu Skin and what others are doing. About 30 years ago, when Weindrich and Proller, who I'll introduce later if you don't know them already, were doing anti-aging science or aging science. They call it gerontology, the study of aging. There's an ology for you, gerontology, right? At that time, there were, I think, 5 labs in the world and 2 in America 30 years ago. And now there's more like 500 labs in America alone that are studying aging. Why do you think that is? Yeah? I've heard it said that the baby boomers have spent all of their health getting their wealth, and now they need to spend all their wealth getting back their health. Right? It's sort of the baby boomer generation thing. We want to age better, and there are so many more people interested in it, and as you said, that's where the money is now, that's where it's going in for the research. The thing is, though, that academics will ruin everything. What they basically do is they just study it and tell you all about what's happening as you age. They're going to tell you what's happening neurologically, why you're forgetting where you put your car keys and you can't even name all of your children yet. and all of the, right now I'm having a problem. Sometimes I call my 10-year-old boy my dog's name and vice versa. It's pretty bad. So what they're doing is descriptive biology. They're telling you what happens during the aging process, but none of them is under the pretense at all that they're going to do anything about it to change it. In fact, they think that that's sort of a bit of a hoaxy kind of a goal. It's a cruel hoax to think that you can change the aging paradigm, right? So what we are looking at is maybe there's something that we can do to change and to slow the aging process. And we're looking specifically at gene expression and how that regulates the aging process. Now, as you'll learn later, we are not learning about, doing some sort of weird science here and creating wolfmen or, what do you call it, the X-Men out of you, right? It's not about that kind of science, but what your body does naturally as it interacts with the plant chemicals that you eat. So this exclusive access that we have that I'm going to share with you on the ultimate sources of aging and genetics, I think has the power really to offer a whole new way of looking at the aging process. So, you've seen, I think, where this all started was when we cracked the code. The DNA code, really, it's just, it's an incredible thing. It really is. The DNA code is the blueprint for life. You've heard that said before, right? And we use that word blueprint, but I actually think it's a little bit wrong, because when you think blueprint, you think two-dimensional plan. But the DNA code is actually a linear code. It's more like a digital thing. So there are letters along that code. There are actually 4 letters, AGTC, right? And 3 letters make a word in that code. So how many words are in the DNA code? 1 billion words. 1 billion words. It's 3 billion letters. And just to give you an idea of how much a billion words is, that's like 900 Bibles. And every cell in the human body has the complete DNA code in linear fashion. It's quite amazing, isn't it? So the job that the scientists were given about 20 years ago was to crack that code. We want you to sequence the whole thing. And the technology's been there for a long time, but that's a lot of letters to get all the order and everything right. But around the turn of the century, we cracked that code. We sequenced the entire human genome. And that brought a huge amount of promise to the genetics world. The doctors and everyone thought that we would start to cure cancer in no time. In fact, Bill Clinton stood up there with Donna Shalala, the Secretary of Health and Human Services at the NIH, where I used to work, and they promised within 10 years we would see huge advancements. An article came out in Reuters just about 6 months ago, and it was basically lamenting the fact that we really haven't seen the advances that we thought we had. But I'm here to tell you that that's a tough call, but that certain things have happened. But let me tell you how difficult it is. So just to sort of get back into perspective, here's the human body. The human body has about 1 trillion cells, right? And if you zoom in on, say, there's the muscle tissue. The muscle tissue is made up of cells, and if you zoom in on the cell, there is our little cell. And we're going to talk about this later, but this area in the middle is the nucleus. That's where the DNA material is kept. And you can see, as I mentioned, here's your chromosome. What's the difference between a chromosome and DNA and a gene? You don't really have to know this, but I think it's kind of fun. The chromosome is really just how the DNA is stored. Can you imagine having 1 billion words on a string of fishing wire? How do you pack that into the middle of the cell without it all getting lost and tangled up? So it's all wrapped on these little spools that end up sort of looking like that chromosome. And there are several of those in each cell. If you unravel it, then you have the DNA strand. And along sections of that DNA are the genes. So each gene is like a recipe. So there are about 25,000 recipes in your body, and that's all you need. 25,000 recipes for the different proteins that can create and maintain the human body. It's pretty amazing, isn't it? And at the turn of the century, we worked out, what the codes are so that we could try to figure it all out. But then what do you do? What's the next step? And like I said, we've been pretty hard on the scientists because they haven't come up with sort of amazing cures for all the diseases. But let me share with you why that's kind of a difficult thing. Can you imagine, as I already said, 1 billion words that basically look like this? Here's the first word, G-A-T, that's going to code for a certain, that's a word. And here's another word, and so on. Can you imagine how many volumes you've got here? I already said it's about 900 Bibles worth. Where do we go from here? It's kind of a difficult task, and I'll share with you an analogy of how difficult it is. Like I said, I'm a geek, so it's not my sports heroes that I love, it's other smart people. Here are the hieroglyphics, and in the 1700s, this was all the rage. You know, they discovered these on the pillars of the temples, in the pyramids, on the sarcophagi of the mummy guys, right? And I got to ask you, if you're from Egypt, couldn't your daddy be a mummy? So, I just couldn't resist the one. So, in the 1700s, just see if you're awake. In the 1700s, they could see all of this writing, and nobody could translate it. And all they could do was write it all down and catalog it, where it all came from, and copy it all down. And they had this, and that was a scientist's job. And others were trying to decipher it. And there was one brilliant guy by the name of Jean-François Champollion. And he was a linguist. By the time he was 9 years of age, he could actually read and write perfectly in ancient Greek and Latin. Pretty amazing, huh? Reading the classics like Homer and Virgil at 9 years of age. And by the time he was 16, he could speak a dozen languages. Most of them dead languages like Assyrian and Persian and Chaldaic and some of these Coptic languages. Why? Because he was obsessed with finally one day being able to find out what had they written on these in ancient languages, the hieroglyphics in Egypt. Well, long story short, he just was stumped by it, as were many other linguists, as brilliant as they were, until Napoleon's army was rooting around in the Nile Delta and found this rock, which we call the Rosetta Stone. It's about 1 meter high, about 20 centimeters thick, and it had 3 languages written on it that all said the same thing in 3 different languages. So you had the hieroglyphics on top, then you had ancient Greek and Coptic. Well, we knew how to speak ancient Greek and Coptic, so now we can zero in on what the hieroglyphics mean. So they, Nile Delta, FedExed that box up to Jean-François Champollion, and he was able to, within a year, decipher the code. Right? So what's the moral of the story here? Well, the code was undecipherable. He needed some sort of Rosetta Stone to be able to interpret it, some frame of reference so that you could get something out of the DNA code. And that is what we have done. Let me share with you our very own Jean-François Champollion. And that would be these 2 guys here, I guess. Rick Weindrich, who has been studying aging for the last 30 years, and Tom Proller. Now, Rick Weindrich has an interesting history. Anyone heard of the biosphere that they built in Arizona about 20 years ago? So that was Roy Wolfert, and his student was Rick Weindrich. Now, many of you, if you follow the story, know that it kind of went wrong, right? They had 7 or 8 people go into the biodome, and they thought that they would be completely self-sufficient from the outside world for a period of years. But there was a problem with the curing of the concrete or something, which affected the growth of the plants in there, and they realized they didn't have enough food. And they were about to pull everyone from the biodome, and Roy Wolfert said, no, don't pull them. There's really interesting research to show that you can survive on lower caloric levels. In fact, the research has shown that you will actually live longer on lower calories as long as you have adequate nutrition. So they left them in there. It was a great experiment, and when they pulled these guys out, they were all died of starvation. No, actually. They pulled them out, and these guys, when they looked at all of their physical parameters, like, blood lipids and health and muscle mass and brain power, all that stuff, they were actually younger. In the time that they'd been in the biodome, they'd actually decreased in biological age, even though their chronological age had increased, right? So aging younger, like we were talking about. So this guy launched on a career of studying aging, and not just documenting what happens as you age, but unlike the other gerontologists, actually seeing if we could reverse it. So he was on a good track, but something dramatic changed. Now, remember I mentioned earlier innovation? Innovation really happens when you get 2 different disciplines that come together and think of something new. And that's what happened. A new technology was born very recently called the gene chip. And Thomas Proller was a bright young student of genetics who was studying cancer genetics, but only because there were no aging genetics labs in the world at the time. And he ended up at Madison, Wisconsin, where Weindrich is, and said, hey, we need to get together. I love the concept of aging and what you're doing, but I have this technology that I think we need to apply to your science, and that is the gene chip. We want to be able to measure the difference between the gene expression pattern of young versus old. Now, what do I mean by gene expression? It's not, the DNA is fixed for life, that code, right? So it's not going to change. But how those genes are expressed does change. It just change with your age. In the difference between young and old, there may be something there. In other words, you've got all those 25,000 recipes. They're not all turned on at once. You have different levels of how much of that recipe is made. And there are controls within the cell that regulate that. So that's what I mean by gene expression. So here's the gene chip. And the beauty of the chip is that you don't just measure the work output of one of those 25,000 genes at a time, but all 25,000 genes in one experiment. Isn't that amazing? So I can get a sample of the DNA, isolate the RNA from it, from that blueprint, and work out the levels of each of those genes. Some up, some down. So, what can we say so far then? Some of the snippets from all of this interesting science. Well, we have exclusive access to 30 years of anti-aging science. It means we have a really good pedigree, I guess you could say, from the anti-aging arena, starting with Rick Weinrich, who has for more than 30 years been studying aging under the famous Roy Walford of Biodome fame, right? We've now patented exclusive to Nu Skin, so as we mentioned earlier, someone mentioned, it was Graham, that we had bought the company. We liked it so much, we bought it. And we have a lot of these patents, and also in ageLOC, so that's a different story. Here's what I think is a really cool thing that you can say, is that we can measure aging at the genetic level. Right? You can look at me and you can see that, well, you can probably guess how old I am for the most part. Receding forehead, I've got a forehead like a beach now. My hair's slightly grey, I've got a few wrinkles if you look up close. You can guess from my outward appearance how old I am. But what if you look at someone's genetics? Can you tell how old they are? Yeah, you can by gene expression, because what they've been able to do is compare Rick Weinrich and Thomas Proller, young versus old, in terms of the gene expression patterns that are there, those heat maps that I'll share with you later. So that's a major thing, measuring aging at the genetic level. Why is that even important? Once you can measure something, then you can hope to change it. Until you can measure it, there's no hope of changing it, right? So once you can measure aging at the genetic level, you can screen for ingredients, hopefully from the plant kingdom, that may actually be changing that pattern of expression back to something that looks more like a youthful pattern that you've already measured. Here's another thing that's really interesting that we've learned from this. The old paradigm is that aging is inevitable, right? There's nothing you can do to influence your inherited genes. I just got it, right? My father is tall, my mother is rather short. You're not that short, are you, Mum? Where are you? There she is, right? But I'm somewhere in between. My father has blue eyes, I got his blue eyes. Those things I can't change. So why on earth would I think that I can change the way that I age? Well, now we do realize, and you saw this Time article and several others already, that was the old paradigm, and the new paradigm is that it's the expression of the genes that's important. It's not just the blueprint, and you can influence those genes back to the expression that looks more like that of a youthful person. So who does the work then? Well, and how do we do it? Well, first of all, as I mentioned, step one is to identify. And without going into a whole bunch of science, really that's what we do. We measure aging at a genetic level. We identify the genes that change as you age. And step two, as I said, is you screen for ingredients so that you can reset. And LifeGen are the experts in terms of what they do. They've got the patents and they have the technology. They're using the gene expression chips. And each one of these chips, how much do you think costs? It's just a little piece of plastic, right? Each one of these is $500, and then it's another $500 to process it. So if you look at the heat maps and you see hundreds of dots on the plot, each one cost about $1,000, so it really adds up. And there are a lot of traps for young players. Like I said, that's a lot of information, and so another thing that LifeGen has done is they've developed this database. It's a new science called bioinformatics. Right? When science and all of the data come back and it's just so much that it's almost like an avalanche. It's like trying to drink out of a fire hydrant, the amount of information that comes back from each of these experiments. 25,000 genes, each experiment, different tissues, different ages. How are you going to figure all that out? This new science called bioinformatics, it uses the power of computer and powerful algorithms to make sense of all of those data. Nu Skin, on its part, has been an expert for nearly 30 years now on anti-aging ingredients. So we know what kind of ingredients to look for. I already talked earlier today about our contacts in China, our professors there, where to find these ingredients, how to screen those even before we put these in this gene expression model. So that's the expertise that we bring to the table. So we make great partners, and we've made great strides already, right? And again, it's all about balance. Some people think that, as you age, maybe they have this concept, all the genes sort of go dim and express themselves less. Actually, some change. Let me give you a quick example. You guys all seem to love the idea of skin, and even though I'm a nutrition scientist, I'm going to give you an example from skin. Let's make our own, what we would call a youth gene cluster for skin. As you age, you know that your skin loses some of its elasticity, right? Have you ever done that experiment where you squeeze the back of your hand? Done that? If you haven't, do it right now. Pinch a piece of skin off the back of your hand and hold it for a little while until it almost hurts. Oh, I can see tears coming out of your eyes there. That's a little hard, right? Okay, now let it go and see how quickly it takes for that line to disappear. Now, people who are really young, that'll snap back really fast, you won't see a line. Older people, it'll take a little while longer. Why is that? Well, there's collagen and elastin in the skin that give it firmness and elasticity, right? So there's two gene products right there, collagen and elastin, right? When you're young, you have more of it, right? Why do you have more elastin and collagen when you're young? The gene expression is up on those. So those genes that code for those proteins, they're being expressed more. As you age, unfortunately, there's another enzyme, and it's called MMP, matrix metalloproteinase. It's basically a protein that's a bit like a Pac-Man, an enzyme that breaks down the collagen, right? So when you're young, you don't have much of that, so expression levels are low. And as you age, the expression levels get higher. So that's kind of cruel, isn't it? As you age, you're making less of the elastin and collagen, and you're making more of the enzyme that breaks it down. So there's a youth gene cluster with 3 genes. When you're young, collagen, elastin gene expression low. High, thank you. See how easy it is to get confused? And then MMP low. And then as you age, those all flip around. So imagine doing that now on all 25,000 genes in the human body. And that's how we're measuring aging at the genetic level. So it's a pretty cool technology, but again, it's about balance. Not everything goes down, not everything goes up. You just want to get the right balance. All right, so what have we done? We've applied that technology, and that's where that technology has already been used in the transformation kit that you're using. It's done great, hasn't it? I mean, it's really nice to see the theoretical genetics actually turning into a product that really works. Let me share with you another example of what we looked at when we first looked at inside the body. What happens as you age? One of the first things is that your energy levels decline. We already talked about that. Go to an 80-year-old's birthday party. Actually, they're probably getting more hip these days. They probably have a rap dancer there and stuff. Definitely.
Hip replacement.
Yeah, hip replacement parties. I can hear that would be pretty cool, right? So energy is declining as we age, and every cell has these little subcellular particles called the mitochondria. Those are like the little, they're really like nuclear power plants. They generate the power. They combine the sugar and energy source with oxygen and burn it and give us power. Well, mitochondria activity declines with age. Unfortunately, they also let off a little bit more metabolic exhaust as you age, so that's free radicals, and that further damages the cells. And we'll talk more about that tomorrow. So as we've looked at this, we thought, well, what can we do from a genetics perspective? Well, to start with, there are about 1,000 genes in the nucleus that are to build the mitochondria and to maintain them. Let's give you a bit of a video of what it really looks like in the cell. This is a live cell that's been stained for mitochondria in fluorescent green. So this area here's the nucleus, only the DNA material in there, so none of these organelles. You see these little guys? It's kind of creepy. They're like alive, they're moving around. Every cell has somewhere between 200 and 500 of these mitochondria that are making energy for you. In every tissue of your body, your brain is particularly important, the muscle and everywhere else. So let's look at those 1,000 genes. And let's do the experiment with the gene chip, focusing in on those and see which of those genes change in expression as you age. And what we found, again, using the database that we have and the bioinformatics science, we were able to narrow it down to 52 genes. So here's, this is actually, this is here somewhere. This is young, you've seen this before, this is old. Each of these lines is actually a different experiment. So these are genetically identical mice that were done in each of these time points, right? 5 minutes to go, all right? And green shows low expression of the gene, and red shows high. So these are the 52 genes that in a young mitochondrial gene expression, that's the pattern that you'll see. And then as you age, this is what happens, they flip around. So that's the youth gene cluster really, where it goes from low and high to high and low, right? You got that? So then what's the next thing? Now that we can measure aging at the genetic level, what's the next step? Sorry? Yeah, we need to reset it. So we will screen for ingredients that we think are promising, that might be classified by perhaps the Chinese in their TCM or other places as anti-aging. So I'll give you an example of an experiment of 5 different ingredients. So here's 5 ingredients that we tested. Now, we're going back to the old. These ingredients were fed to an individual that had old gene expression pattern like this. And the goal is to set it back to youthful gene expression. Out of those 5 ingredients, I think you can see pretty clearly which one works the best, right? Yeah, ingredient number 4 works really nicely. So if you compare them side by side, they look not identical, but you have had a major reset go on there, which is far more than we actually expected. We were jumping up and down when we saw these results. That's pretty dang exciting. And it turns out that this particular ingredient was one of those ancient Chinese ingredients that was known to be good for stamina and a few other things. So very exciting results, and we're able to do that with others. Now, I've got a couple of minutes left. Cordyceps. Yeah. So we were able to put in other ingredients that had similar results, right? And also keep in mind, I'm keeping this simple for you. There are a few layers of complexity here. And one is that we have to look at different tissues, the brain, the heart, the muscle, and look at how different ingredients affect the gene expression in those different tissues. That's the science of epigenetics. So there are a few layers of complexity, but I think this gives you really the gist of what we're doing and how exciting it is. So the next thing then is we've done the genetics experiments, and that's all very academic, but does it really make a difference? So when we've found which ingredients do reset and we put those together, that's called formulation, then we do experiments to see if they really work. Practically, do they affect function? So if we're talking about energy, what are the things that you think of? You think of how far you can run, how fast you can run, what's your stamina like, right? So here's some mice on a treadmill, and these guys were trained mice. So they could, if they were humans, they were the guys that were training for the half marathon, right? And over a period of time, you see on the treadmill, those that were fed the ingredients, the ageLOC ingredients, were actually lasting much longer on the treadmill. Okay, quite significant, longer levels of stamina. Here's another experiment that showed that you can actually measure the glycogen. The glycogen is the muscle, one of the main muscle food sources, right? Glycogen is basically just the condensed sugar in the muscle in the liver. And the more of that you have, the further you can run, I guess. It's just sort of your fuel level, right? So you can measure before the exercise and see, okay, you've got a full tank. So consider this non-exercise control. These guys are trained. They could run a half marathon if they wanted to any day, but today they're just having a rest. They've got the Disney Channel on, and they're just watching TV on their little mouse couches, and they've got full fuel. They haven't used any up, right? Yes, gosh. And here's the exercise control. So these are the guys that aren't on the ageLOC ingredients, but today they've done their half marathon. And at the end of the marathon, you can sample the glycogen in their muscle, and sure enough, they've used up this much. That's how much fuel it takes to run the half marathon. Here are the guys on the ageLOC ingredients. And you can see that we've turned a rusty old pickup truck that's blowing smoke and getting, I don't know, how do you measure years? Liters per 100 kilometers, right? So I don't know, maybe it's using 20 liters per 100 kilometers, and you've turned it into a 5 liter per 100 kilometer hybrid. Now, how have we done that? Because the mitochondria still need an energy source. That's kind of interesting. It turns out that as you get older, when you're young, the mitochondria, they like fat and they like sugar as a food, as an energy source, just the same. But as you age, it seems like you prefer, the mitochondria prefer sugar. They prefer pure sugar rather than fat. And that may explain why, as we get older, it's a little bit harder to sort of lose that little ring around the middle, right? So there's another story in there that's really interesting. But in this sense, they've made those mitochondria more efficient. They've turned them back into more youthful-looking mitochondria. And here's another one that's kind of cool. Cognitive function. It turns out that, you know the analogy of the canary in the coal mine, right? Right? They're the first guys, they're so sensitive to methane gas, that if there's methane gas around, they keel over and everyone runs screaming out of the mine, right? So the brain is a little bit like the canary in the coal mine for mitochondrial activity. When mitochondrial activity declines, you first notice it in your cognitive function. So we thought it's important to do an experiment with cognitive function in humans. So this is a pilot experiment that we did with or without the vitality, and a few other data points there. A whole bunch of kind of difficult tests, computer-based, short-term memory, executive decision-making. You had to get the answers right and you had to get them fast. And this is kind of interesting because, you know, as you age, they've just done, a couple of weeks ago, an experiment came out, was published, and it showed, you know, recognition of certain objects. And they had, you know, 30 and 20-year-olds and 50-plus-year-olds. And what's this object? It's a spanner, right? And it showed that by the time you're 50, even though you could still recognize objects, it took you a little longer to recognize them. That kind of sucks. Because, you know, as new skin distributors, you have to remember people's names, right? Locations, you know, all sorts of things. Words have to come to your mind. You're giving presentations, and if you can't quite think of the word fast enough, it really can affect your performance. So this is something you should be acutely interested in. How can you reverse that? Well, as you can see from this, there's a wonderful experiment. We showed that those that were on the vitality learned faster. You know, everyone got better over time because that's just practicing. They were doing the same kinds of skills, right? So item number one, it's important to keep your brain alive and do those crossword puzzles or whatever it is that you do to keep yourself alive, learn another language, become a new skin distributor. And then the other thing is that on the vitality though, they learned faster, and after 12 weeks were 20% better off in all of those cognitive tests. So that's a really nice indication there. So my time is up. If you have skeptical friends who are doctors, like I said, your job is not to sort of be able to know and regurgitate the science. I think that might make us a little boring. You know, the products work, this is exciting science. We can measure aging at the genetic level, and all of those things that we mentioned earlier. But if you want more details, if you go to the website, there's an article that I wrote, which is more geared towards doctors, that goes into detail of everything that I just explained today. So I think that summarizes the ageLOC. Let me just pass on one more thing. You know, it doesn't have to suck to get old. But you know, if we don't do it right, if we don't sort of latch onto some of those secrets of how to change the aging paradigm, aging can become a harder thing, right? We do want to die young, as late in life as possible, but we don't want to be sort of have years of life that aren't productive. And you know, something really sad happened in Japan recently. One of the cabinet ministers for the new prime minister said, you know, these old people in this country, they are such a drain on our medical resources and our money. I wish they would just hurry up and die. Do you know he literally said that? Can you imagine that? What kind of future does a politician like that have? And you know, I'm here to tell you, you know, a much more positive spin on aging through ageLOC technology. Eleanor Roosevelt once said that young, beautiful young people are accidents of nature, but beautiful old people are works of art. And that's what we're going for, right?